Alrighty, we will get started. So first off, thank you all for joining us today as we explore a day in the life of a pronoun. The Polaron team would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and their continued connection to land, sea, and the community. I'd like to start off with the agenda. We will firstly introduce our panelists and hear from Polaron's founder before moving to our case study, panel discussion, and finally finishing off with the Q&A. Just a reminder that we will answer all your questions and comments during the Q&A section at the end of this webinar. First off, I would like to introduce James Sow. He's an experienced facilitator, community advisor, and program manager. As a board and committee member, he provides advice and insights on multicultural, intersectional, and vulnerable communities to influence policies and programs. Welcome, James. Next up, I would like to introduce Dominic Carter. Dominic is the director at Polaron Language Services and holds a master's degree in the theory of language and literature. Today, Dominic will present the significance of pronouns. Wonderful to have you, Dominic. I would also like to introduce Dr. Miranda Lay. She's a senior lecturer in interpreting and translation studies at RMIT University and is currently the lead researcher in creating a multilingual LGBTIQA+ glossary. Welcome, Doctor. And I would also like to give a warm welcome to Eva Hussein. Eva is the founder and director of Polaron Language Services and is a certified translator, interpreter, and a NADI examiner. Now, Eva, before you tell me a bit about Polaron, there's something you wanted to discuss first. What is the vote in the voice referendum?
Thank you, Angelo, and welcome everyone. Before we get started on the topic of pronouns in translation, I wanted to make everybody aware of a set of resources we have just developed with Life Without Barriers. And these are resources that we have translated into more than 45 languages to do with voting in the upcoming referendum. We have developed a fact sheet, 3 social media tile, and 30-second video in lots of languages. So what I'd like us to do is distribute this information. As we know, voting in the referendum is compulsory for all eligible voters. So it's important that our communities are aware of this. So this is just a short message. The resources sit with Life Without Barriers on the website, and at the end of this session we'll show you a little bit more about that. Thank you. And just very briefly, I think a lot of people know who we are. So we've been around since 2000. This is our 23rd year. We do translations, interpreting in about 170 different languages. Look, today, just very briefly, we're going to be talking about pronouns because it's a topic that comes up all the time. So I'll get you to move on to the next slide. I'll hand over to Dominic, who will tell us about the significance of pronouns across all languages. Over to you, Dominic.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you, Eva. Welcome to our webinar and to this quick presentation on the significance of pronouns. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what are pronouns, and I'm going to mostly focus on the English language because the rest of the debate will be about translation. So what is a pronoun? A pronoun is a word that stands in for another word, for a noun, or for a noun phrase in written and spoken English. So what is a noun? It's something like your name, or it's a profession, or it's a word that describes an object, a cat, an animal, whatever it is. A noun phrase would be several of those things glued together, like the church in the middle of the village is a noun phrase, for example. They cover all sorts of things. I was still on the first slide. Thank you. Let's go. Okay. So pronouns allow users of languages to be more economical when speaking. So you don't have to keep repeating the phrase that the pronoun stands for. That's quite obvious. And the pronoun has the same function and obeys the same grammatical rules as the noun it replaces. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So here are a few examples. I am a soldier, so I stands for Dominic. Dominic is a soldier. I am a soldier. That is fairly easy, and I stands in for that. If we wanted to replace soldier with a pronoun, we could say it. I am it, and that would be equally clear in context if you knew I was a soldier, and that's what I was talking about. Give me that. That is a pronoun, and that stands for anything you want. The plate of sausages I have in my hand, or $500, whatever it is. I don't like him very much. So I, of course, is me, but him will be a male person typically that I'm referring to. I don't like Angelo very much. I don't like him very much. Quite easy there. It's not true, by the way, Angelo. You're lovely. Don't go there, girlfriend. There is a place. So a place, let's say it's the church again in the middle of the village. There stands for the church in the middle of the village. It is mine. Mine is a possessive pronoun. Mine stands for something that, my something. So there you go. These are simple examples, but there are plenty of pronouns around. They represent people, objects, places, so on and so forth. Can we have the next slide, please? So why are we talking about pronouns is probably quite relevant today. You've mentioned earlier that LGBTQIA+, we're having a glossary being prepared. The main challenge around pronouns is precisely around this, because the LGBTQIA+ movement, shall we say, if we can call it that, is bringing to the fore the notion that people's gender is somewhat fluid, and pronouns represent people in this context. Pronouns. So which pronouns are we talking about? We're talking about the I, you, he, her, and they quite a lot. And these pronouns refer specifically to people. Can we move to the next slide? And people relate to that pronoun. So it affects your sense of identity, and it how you portray yourself and how you are being portrayed. So people's identity might match their sex, it might not match their sex. And there are plenty of identities around, but typically they're sort of grouped into man, woman, non-binary, and these things can change. It's fluid. You might feel like one in the morning, the other one later, or in one part of your life, and so on. So you have to be quite careful when using pronouns in this context. I personally am what is called cisgender. I identify with my birth sex. So you can call me him or he or him, but I would equally be able to be referred to as her or they if I preferred that. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's just remember that you can't think of people as just male and female. It doesn't quite work like that. And that the pronouns that people use feel very personal. It's offensive to use the wrong pronouns. So it makes people feel unappreciated, disrespected. So it is quite essential, really, to do that, to use pronouns and be careful about how you use pronouns. So let's move on to the next slide again, please. So yes, pronouns affirm parts of a person's identity. And as a general rule, you can't tell a person's pronouns just by looking at them. It used to be like that. But nowadays, you need to be mindful that that a pronoun doesn't necessarily match what you're seeing. And there are plenty of methods. I presume we'll be talking about those as part of the panel discussion on how to cope. What are the mechanisms? What do you do if you use the wrong pronoun? So on and so forth. But essentially, yes, you need to be aware of what a person's pronouns are. Where, for example, some of us are using it in the way we presented our name in the Zoom meeting by having our pronouns written after our names. People do it in LinkedIn a lot as well, on profiles and Facebook and emails. That's an easy way to get started when it's written down. In spoken conversation, it's a little bit more delicate. So typically asking someone is probably the most obvious way of doing it, and shows that you're taking a proactive step to do it. So there you go. Let's go to the next slide, if you don't mind. Okay, so what does it mean for pronouns? Because pronouns are set in a sort of, let's call it traditional way, of a man being a man, a woman being a woman, and he applies to men, and then she applies to women. So we don't really have neutral or epicene pronouns. Epicene is a word that has neither characteristics of male or female, or both. So something neutral, I guess, is a way of thinking about that. So we need to think about that. So we can repurpose pronouns, and very, very typically in English anyway, we use they. They is used as a neutral pronoun, and it helps that, you know, it stops you from being categorized as a he or a she, but it comes with its own oddness to a certain degree. While the change is still fresh and still modern and happening, it feels sometimes a little odd, and maybe it's unclear because you have to use a plural verb for a singular person. How do you deal with the possession? You know, they have a cat. You know, it's theirs, it's hers, I don't know. It's not always clear. So, and it implies some sort of multiplicity. Does it imply that you're both? Does it imply that you're neither? I wouldn't be fully satisfied with they if I wasn't satisfied with he or her personally. But again, the language has to follow. The language has to follow the change. It might need to change. Grammatically, of course, as I've just mentioned, it's a bit odd. Okay, I'm being told I'm running out of time already. So, Angelo, can you move to the next slide, please? So we're repurposing pronouns like that, or we have to rethink and invent a new pronoun like sie and here. Sie is pronounced like sie, that's good. And it kind of replaces she, he, they, and here is pronounced here, and is replaces it's the possessive pronoun. So that's a very creative thing, and you will see if we have the opportunity in our panel discussion again, you will see that that's what has to happen in a lot of languages, because there's no they. They doesn't work the same way in French, for example, as it does in English. Let's move on to the next slide. So here are what our pronouns are currently in English: she and he, her, him, his, hers. And then the neutral ones underneath, they, as we've just discussed, and this the z with a few variations there as well. Okay, is that the end of my is there more slides? Yes, so let's just remember, pronouns do not equate to gender anymore, and using the personal pronouns in a correct way is the best way to promote inclusiveness, inclusivity within your organization, in your life in general. It shows respect, and it helps people affirm the choices that they make regarding their genders. Do not make any assumptions when you look at people, and the act of making an assumption is generally harmful. Even if you guess correctly, you're still guessing. So it shows you're not necessarily paying proper deference to the pronoun situation. That's it for me. So do's and don'ts are going to be quite simple. Ask people what their preferred pronouns are. When you're introducing people in conversation, typically you say 2 or 3 things about them to the person you introduce. Try and use their personal pronouns while doing that to help the person being introduced to go smoothly, that process to go smoothly. When you're listening to people, try and listen in very carefully for their pronouns if you're not being introduced. Name tags in public events, of course, is a great way. And if you don't make a song and dance, you know, pronouns is just a human right. Don't overemphasize that you're working on getting pronouns right. Just try and get them right. And don't tell people, don't be silly. You're clearly a man with a beard, so you're a he. That would be very offensive. So there you go. I think that was my last slide. So thank you very much. Did I stick to my allotted time?
You did. You only over by 1 minute, but nevertheless, we very much appreciate this speedy summary of where we at linguistically and socially. So we'll move on to the panel discussion now, and thank you, Dominic, again for your presentation. And you can see on the screen there a few talking points, which we've already kind of covered. What is a pronoun? Why are they significant? And we do have a few experts in the field of translation on board, myself included. I think you could call me that even. So we're going to be talking about how they're handled in translations, because there are some languages that don't have pronouns, and there are other languages that are very gendered. In other words, for me to tell you anything, I have to tell you what gender I am in a sentence. So that can become quite tricky when we translate from English into other languages and vice versa. And how can we be more inclusive and also aware that, you know, the way that we talk about pronouns in English and we use them in English has changed, and how do we apply those changes, you know, social changes, I guess, to translation? And how can we do better than what we're doing at the moment? Because I think there's a little bit of a way to go. So I might ask James and Miranda to turn their cameras on, please. And might start with you, James, if that's okay. You know, if you could tell us what is the significance of a pronoun. And I know that you are, apart from doing research work, you also on a couple of multicultural advisory boards. You're very connected to the community. So maybe if you could couch it in that and tell us a bit more about why does it matter? What's the significance of pronouns?
Oh, thank you, Eva. And thanks to Dominic as well for the splendid introduction. I think I might steal a few of your slides to be used for my workshops in the future. I was wondering, yeah, as I was reflecting on the question, I believe that the use of a pronoun, I think in an English context sort of gives affirmation and it sort of gives someone a gender identity, right? When we use traditional pronouns like, you know, he, she, they. However, I think now we are moving towards an era where we begin to understand and to validate and to recognize the diversity and the spectrum of gender identities that are starting to emerge, perhaps say in the last 5 to 6 years. And so the language that we use, perhaps also in the English context, yeah, does not seem to catch up. Right? Because the way that we understand certain concepts, ideas, and this includes gender identity, can only be described by the language that we use. So English, in terms of pronoun, it is quite limited, which is why Dominic has explained just now, we are seeing the emergence of new pronouns like ze, ze, and so on. And that's what I'm noticing at the moment. It is really an affirmation, a validation, and acknowledgement of someone's gender identity. However, I think in the context of translation, and we work with non-English languages, that can be tricky because in other languages, the concept of pronouns does not quite exist. And so yeah, I was just speaking to an Indonesian friend today who has explained to me as part of my research that, for example, in Bahasa Indonesia, they would use words like dia, you know, which is like a genderless or a gender neutral pronoun. And so they would follow that up, like say with a name or, to identify that person. So I think in the context of translation or non-English languages, it can be a little bit tricky. Yeah.
And of course, James, you speak a number of languages, because
Yes.
when I first tapped you on the shoulder and I said, you've got to come to this webinar and present, I learned a little bit more about your background, and even across the languages that you speak, there are variations in terms of how pronouns are managed, you know, linguistically. Forget about the social aspect of it. You know, you come, I believe, from Malaysia originally, right?
Singapore.
Singapore.
Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
where there are several dominant languages, including English, that kind of, you know, it's an amalgam and a very multicultural community as well.
Yes.
When lots of different languages are spoken. So how is that handled in Singapore?
It's a little bit tricky. I think in Singapore's context, the acknowledgement and the understanding of the spectrum of gender identities, particularly in the LGBTIQA+ community, they are catching up. But I think compared to Australia, they are a little behind in terms of the public or the governmental recognition. So that's going to be a little bit tricky. What I noticed, because speaking from my own experience, like I speak Mandarin and Cantonese. So, for example, there is a difference between English and, say, Mandarin, or English and Cantonese when we write and also when we speak, because some of the words, even though in writing, there is a differentiation. Say, for example, in Chinese, when we refer to a male or a female, but when we speak, it sounds the same. So yes, correct. So you wouldn't be able to tell if you're talking about a male or a female in the third person, right? And there's just one example. So in Cantonese, for example, that's a little bit tricky because there is only one third person pronoun that refers to that person, as in like he, she, or they. So it is a little tricky. So it is not that straightforward. And I also want to highlight this important point that while today's discussion webinar is about the use of pronoun in understanding someone's gender identity, there is an emerging group of people which prefer, even though they identify as cisgender male or female, and they do not identify as a member of the LGBTIQA+ community, they do prefer to use genderless pronouns like they, we, and so on.
Okay.
But that comes from a more advocacy or a political kind of background.
Space.
Because they feel that, oh, there shouldn't be any differentiation, there shouldn't be any gender differences, you know, so it should be equitable. So some people are using genderless pronouns not because they identify as transgender or as non-binary, but because they feel that there shouldn't be any gender differentiation in the way that we address someone. So this comes from a more advocacy or a political, I would say, source. Yeah.
Right. And I can see Miranda smiling there, so I'll hand over in a minute, but I just wanted to throw something in, and that is some languages have 3 genders. So, for example, my native language of Polish has got it when we refer to a child. So when you talk about a child, the child doesn't have a gender. It has an it, and we also have objects that have genders, but that's another story. But in terms of the social space, what Poland promotes is actually making words more gendered. So they've introduced things like directress, and you know, in English we don't say actress much anymore. We say actor, whereas in some countries the push is towards the other end, because it's the recognition of women and their input in into society and how the equitable or otherwise they are. So there are these really weird words that are coming up everywhere that are gendered rather than genderless. But anyway, I'm going to get Angela to move on to the next slide, and I'll also ask Miranda about how pronouns are handled in translation. You've been in this space for many, many years, and you're actually instrumental in shaping the new generation of translators and interpreters, because you teach us. Is it a challenge? Why is it a challenge? And what do we do about it?
Thanks so much, Eva. I'm in fierce agreement with Dominic, what you said, and also James. Translation of this field, it is really tricky in the sense that I'm kind of in two minds, if I could answer it that way, in the sense that if you do it literally, I believe you translate, for example, from English into all the languages. If you look at all these pronouns, literally, I am sure most languages you are able to handle it. However, for example, now we are advocating to use this third person they to denote this gender neutral third person he, she. Rather than he, she, we say they. I'm sure literally in many languages you are able to translate they, plural third person. However, the application of plural they in the target language, whether it works or not, that's another question. From our current project, where we have a list of more than 100 terms in this LGBTIQA plus space, translating all these terms into 6 target languages. By the looks of it, like I said, in most cases, you are able to translate, but whether they works in the target culture and language, that's another issue. If I remember correctly, or Angelo, if you could help me move on to that quick slide, we might be able to show our audience, for example, if people look at 1, 2, 3, 4, number 4 row, where we see they in third person to denote gender neutral, like what we are talking about here. In Arabic, you don't have such thing the way we want to use it in this sense, if that makes sense to people here. You can say they, of course, in plural form, but it doesn't give people the sense that, oh, okay, I'm referring to someone who prefers to be identified as gender neutral. Okay, so that is the challenge there. In a lot of cases, you have to wait for the language to kind of slowly develop, to catch up with the idea. And then slowly you might be able to achieve that. Or you might be able to resort to a different translation strategy by creating a new word, like what Dominic, you were mentioning, Z, here, that sort of words in, say, Arabic to get by. That is something to be observed. Second column here, Chinese. James, you mentioned that. These days, for example, for this they, third person gender neutral term, in Chinese, well, they go for a completely different translation strategy by going for so-called neologism. You create a new word. Therefore, rather than say feminine she or masculine he in the singular term, they import the Roman characters, TA, because that pronunciation is exactly the same as he in Chinese, ta, she in Chinese. It's a homonym, if you like. They pronounce the same, like James said. So he and she in Chinese, they pronounce the same, ta. Therefore, for they, third person gender neutral, it becomes TA. Ha, the pronunciation, but then it doesn't mean he, doesn't mean she. So that's a neologism that you get by. So if you look at that row, different languages, they might resort to different strategies. For some languages, there is no way to go by. Therefore, they might need to resort to other ways by saying, ladies and gentlemen, you include everything rather than creating a new term. So I suppose at the end of the day, you might need to be creative. That's one way, or you might need to use other language resources to get by being inclusive. But then currently in linguistic terms, you do not really have something like a they to use to denote this third person gender neutral situation. So very tricky. in a
Go,
nutshell.
James. Go. I know you're keen to say something.
Yes, I hope it's okay to ask
Yeah.
Miranda this question, because I grew up in a place where we have a strong bilingual policy since year one in education, and that started since the 70s. And so I grew up in an environment where we were taught two languages, so it's English and something else. And I believe that there are huge benefits, right? So I'm wondering that whether in an Australian context, if we make a bilingual policy mandatory, right, in all primary schools and in high schools, would it help people to appreciate languages more? Because I believe that a bilingual person makes you somewhat bicultural as well. You are able to understand the nuances and the poetry and all the very subtle differences in language. And what I notice is that there is no direct translation for all English words into other languages. And the reverse is also true as well. There are also other words in other languages that do not have an accurate English translation as well. So in the context of pronouns, I'm wondering, Miranda, whether it makes sense that if we have to find a somewhat equivalent description of someone's gender identity, is it possible for that particular language and that culture to evolve slowly for the public discourse of gender identity and language and words to be used to evolve and to grow over time so that they can be richer as well, rather than looking at how English can be translated to that and something else can be translated back to English? What are your thoughts on that?
I am in complete agreement with you, James. I suppose every single language and culture is in their own journey. That's the way I see it, because at the end of the day, humanity is the same. That you have, a lot of societies put it this way, is heteronormal. You look at gender in this binary lens, but then more and more, the more we understand, human beings, the more we come to the realization that, gender is, like we say, it is a social construct. Therefore, it really just is a case for every single society to kind of take on board the concept and start to look into this issue and then start to appreciate, accept, so on and so forth, and create the language to accommodate, to express, to allow people to, express themselves the way they feel authentic to themselves. So yes, absolutely. I think for every single society, language, and culture, like I said, my way of seeing it is they go on their own journey. I am hopeful that at the end, we are all heading to the right direction. Some cultures, some languages might be more challenging because of their social cultural environment, but eventually humanity is humanity. And hopefully towards the end, everybody is heading towards that way, being open-minded, being able to allow everyone to be able to self-express however way they feel they are really, being authentic to themselves.
I think on this note, it is so important for everyone to show a little bit of patience and compassion when it comes to interacting with people of different gender identities, different cultural backgrounds as well, right? Because particularly in Australia, we are so multicultural. And in terms of gender identity expressions and the LGBTIQA+ identity is so diverse, it's so important for us to exercise that patience, because language is extremely limiting in describing our identities, the way we feel. And so while language has to catch, it is a live thing, right? It is not set in stone. It is not concrete. While there are certain grammatical structures, they also change over time as well. And so no matter what language we write or speak, I think it is so important to keep that public discourse alive and respectful so that we can come up with new pronouns, new words that can better describe the way we feel, our identities, and so on, I feel. So it's because I feel that fear doesn't make progress. So if people are afraid to ask questions and they say, what is this about? Or if people get offended so easily that other people are afraid to interact with them and to understand better, it doesn't promote the intercultural understanding. And in this context, when I say culture, I don't necessarily mean race, because culture to me, it is the collective outlook, values, attitudes, lived experiences of different groups of people. So in order for the intercultural understanding to deepen and to inform the language that we write and use and speak, it's so important to like keep that conversation going, I feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've made some really pertinent points. And I think the other thing to say is that it's a very evolving space. And I think we all need to be just a little bit out of our comfort zone with this new or relatively new concepts. But we need to be respectful of each other. Dominic, please contribute before we move on to the next slide. You've got something to say, I can see.
Oh, I always have something to say. First of all, on the cultural context, of course, very true. I agree with Miranda and James. Absolutely, you're knocking, bashing a wide open door here in terms of agreement. I liken the LGBTQI plus change to feminism. Let's say it's a movement that changed society, but today we're still fighting with that feminism. Women are still not considered equal. There's a gender pay gap still, even in Australia. So this change is a very slow and progressive one. It's not a change to language, but it's a change to society. It's a change to cultural norms, and so on and so forth. And Ava was talking about, for example, these professions in Polish being feminized. So there's a feminine version, a female version of an otherwise male-dominated profession. But really, what we're asking society to do now is move towards genderless. So this feminist movement that's barely catching up now linguistically in Poland is going to have to be replaced soon enough with something else that doesn't privilege gender. So that's one thing I just wanted to put on the radar.
Yeah.
It's very hard to get these changes to happen. It's going to be a slow, painful process. Lots of people are going to be confused, uncomfortable, offended. All sorts of things are going to happen. Just like feminism, people were thinking, why would women be allowed to vote? Or I don't want a woman president, or whatever. All sorts of crazy things like that seem crazy now, but back then were normal to a large number of people. So there is that cultural change needed. On the linguistic side, which is the bit that fascinates me the most, I think, the knock-on effect of pronouns. The knock-on effect of changing pronouns. So we've just looked at pronouns on their own, and we've already identified some problems. The pronouns don't exist. There's no notion of they that translates. English is one of probably the easiest languages in which to effect this change, because we have they, and we're quite comfortable changing they. We actually have a neutral pronoun, but it's quite offensive. We think of it for animal and objects. We have an it. So transpose that into other languages where there is a neutral pronoun. Should you use it or should you not? Then when you choose a pronoun, what happens to all the rest of the language, all the adjectives, all the verbs, all the conjugation that depends according to language, whether it's male, female. So you have to have a whole set of declensions to deal with the new pronouns or the changed use of an existing pronoun. And then what happens to the old usage of that? Do we keep, for example, in French, we still have genders for feminine and masculine for anything. A chair, a table has a gender, a person has a gender, everything has a gender. The adjectives for, a beautiful chair sounds different. It spells differently, it sounds differently. Whether it's a feminine object or a male object. So if we have to invent or change these words to adapt the new pronouns, what happens to the old versions of the words? Do we have to change the genders of tables as well? Should we switch the whole? I don't know what the answer is.
Well, the strange thing is that a table might be feminine in French, but it's masculine in Poland. So I don't know in Polish. So I don't know who's made those rules. But guess what? We're rapidly running out of time, which just goes to show what an important and interesting discussion this has been. And we're not going to be able to cover challenges in translating pronouns to a large extent, but we've already kind of covered it quite a bit in what all of you have said. And I did want to leave about 5 minutes for questions at the end, so we might move on to that. And thank you. I thought it was really interesting, and it's an evolving space. So we do need to understand that language is not something that's set in stone. If you look at English spoken 100 years ago, it's very different than today, and I think it's evolving. It's also a dominant and aggressive language that inserts itself into others. Whenever I travel to Europe, I can hear half of Polish is now English. So what are you going to do? You have to live with it, right? Okay, Angela, over to you. We've got about 4 minutes for questions, maybe one or two, please.
Yeah. So we'll go through a couple. So the first one was submitted by Gus. Thank you, Gus. So his question is, LS in Spanish is being used, but it is not accepted by the Academy. This is a problem for translators, with Spanish being a prescriptive language where the rules are handed down by the Academy. What would you recommend in such situations?
The only person that can answer this question is Dr. Miranda Lai. If you can, please go for it.
I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that. Yes, I am aware that a lot of these kind of newer terms or created terms are not yet accepted, or I don't know if it's ever going to be accepted by your academy. Therefore, I suppose, again, coming back to what we were saying, that this is a journey for every culture and language. I am sure a little bit further down the track, there might be changes. The academy might pick up new terms or create new terms or accept variations. But for the time being, yes, we say that it's an evolving thing. There might not be a perfect solution for the time being. So I'm so sorry, Gus, I don't really have an answer for you.
We'll see if we can find some more information for you. But of course, then it's also important to say that translation is not an exact science. It's never going to be perfect because of cultural and linguistic differences. So I think, having this conversation will hopefully help. And I think, again, who knows what we're going to talk about or use in 5 years' time. All right, last question, I think, Angela, please.
Yeah, this will be the last one. So in a perfect society, should everyone be simply referred to as they, them, or a gender-neutral term to prevent offensive language? What do you guys think?
I feel that one goes to James.
Well, I'm a little ambivalent about this, actually. On the one hand, yes, it does, with reference to what Dominic said earlier about feminism, and are we progressing towards a genderless or a gender neutral space where gender is really not important? So we do not have to identify whether a person is male, female, or, non-binary. Is that important to us? To a certain extent, while it may break down that kind of a mental divide or that kind of an inequity that has existed, that has been happening for many, many years, right? Between males and females traditionally in the political space, in the civic space as well. I am a bit ambivalent because on the other hand, I was also thinking somehow I have a funny feeling that using gender pronouns does give someone's that kind of gender identity, which some people prefer to keep.
Or claim, even, or reclaim. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I'm sort of sitting on the fence with this. So
the jury's
which way
out.
we're going? Hey?
The jury's out, James. So we just need to keep having these conversations, and we might need to be flexible and leave it at that. Some people, we go with people's preferences. That's the other thing. That's the other option. Yeah.
Yep.
And on that note, we have run out of time. But I just wanted to say a sincere thank you to Dr. Miranda Lai and also James So and Dominic for your contribution, for your very interesting takes on this space, which is ever evolving and very interesting. So thank you. We'll keep having these conversations, and maybe we catch up in a couple of years' time and see where things are at. But we had a really good attendance. So thank you everyone who's attended the webinar. And I did just lastly wanted to encourage everybody to, again, go to Life Without Barriers and download all the wonderful resources we've created for the Voice to Parliament referendum that's coming up. We don't have a date yet, but we're hoping to develop a few more resources. So these are free and available to distribute amongst your communities. And once again, thank you, Dominic, Miranda, James, and Angelo for running this session today. Really